So last year I made a video comparing the 3 design revisions of the Xbox 360 console, from the Phat version to the Slim version to the E version. And in that video I compared them, showed the differences between the designs, the ports, all these different features, and then at the end I came to a conclusion on which one I would recommend as a console to just pick up and play if you want to have a reliable Xbox 360 experience in 2023, now 2024, and soon to be 2025, because I still stand by my recommendation in that video. But a lot of people commented about how I didn't really give the original Phat Xbox 360 a fair shake, because there were several revisions within the same chassis, mainly with the motherboard, and that there were some that were more reliable and some that were less reliable, and in general I should have just said the Xbox 360 had a reliable version and not say this. I have a very hard time recommending this to anybody because this is the generation that really struggled with the Red Ring of Death. It wasn't an if, but a when for certain models, which is why I also don't recommend, if you're buying this generation, getting a console from 2005 to 2006. Even though I did specify some models, but regardless, you all asked for it, and so I'm going to give it to you. This is a comparison of each of the revisions of the Xbox 360 Phat version. So let's dive in. And so of course, if we're going to do a comparison, we have to start at the beginning with the Xenon motherboard. Now, this is the first revision of the Xbox 360 that came out in 2005. This basically got rushed to the market because Microsoft wanted to beat Sony at the launch of the new console generation, and they succeeded. Because keep in mind, when Microsoft launched the original Xbox, they were going up against the PlayStation 2, which was the most sold console in history. So they really knew that they had to step their game up in order to even compete with Sony. So when they launched this console, it came out ahead of the PlayStation 3, and it was less expensive than the PS3, and the PS3 did not beat the Xbox 360 in sales until the very end of this console generation. So Microsoft did a pretty good job, except for the fact that pushing it to market so quickly came with one pretty major hiccup, being the Red Ring of Death. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm not going to go into detail on the Red Ring of Death. If you want to look more into that, Microsoft made their own documentary about it, but basically the motherboard would get so hot under the GPU that it would warp and crack the solder joints, causing the console to fail. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is that I want to show you, without taking the console apart, how you can tell which version of the Xbox 360 you have, because, as many people pointed out in the comments of my previous video, there are some versions of the Phat Xbox 360 that are more reliable and others that are not. The Xenon being the one that is not. So then, getting right into the point of this video, how can I tell without opening this console up that this is a Xenon motherboard Xbox? Well, there's a couple ways to tell. All of them are going to be around the back of the console. So if we turn it around, the first thing you might notice if you have a later generation of the Xbox 360 is that there is no HDMI port under the AV port. Fun fact, actually, the Xbox 360 didn't get an HDMI port until 2007 with the launch of the Elite version of the console. Before that, it was an AV port, and if you got the core version, you got an AV cable that went to composite, which meant you could only play at 480p, but if you got the premium version, which is what I have here, you actually got a composite component combo cable with a digital optical port. So if you wanted to have HD, even though it was going through component, you would have to buy the premium version. Another way you can tell this is a Xenon motherboard is by the power socket. This is also how a lot of guides show you how to tell. So in this power socket, you're gonna have 6 prongs for the power connector, as well as a bar up at the top and a little central prong for supporting or centering. I don't know why it's there, but when you look at that and you see no HDMI port, that's how you can tell that this is a Xenon motherboard. Now that's all fine and well, but there is one other thing when you're looking at these AV-only versions of the Xbox 360 that you have to keep an eye out for, and that is the info sticker on the back. Because when the Red Ring of Death started to affect these consoles, it was so bad that Microsoft actually extended the warranty for these consoles, and so when you look at the back, you'll see one of 2 stickers. You'll see a manufacture date sticker, which is what we have on this console, meaning that it has never been serviced by Microsoft ever. It's never even been opened. The warranty sticker's still on the front. But the other sticker is the service date sticker, meaning that it has been opened by Microsoft. They have done some sort of refurbishing, whether it be a board replacement or whatever. If it's an AV only version, it's probably a board replacement for the Red Ring of Death. And if that's the case, there is a high likelihood that you are going to have an ELPIS motherboard. Now, the ELPIS motherboard is literally just the Xenon motherboard with a slightly refined, or at least slightly better version of the GPU. From everything I could tell, it's not really a massive change and was just a fix for Red Ring of Death motherboards. So really, if you see this where it's the power plug and the AV plug that line up with the Xenon version, but you have a service date sticker, you're probably rocking an ELPIS motherboard. But if you happen to have a manufacturer date sticker instead of a service date sticker and everything lines up to be a Xenon, well, you have a ticking time bomb, also known as a Xenon motherboard. Now, for the sake of accuracy, I do have to mention that there is one other AV-only version of the Xbox 360 motherboard called the Opus motherboard, and this was introduced around July of 2008. This was also used as a replacement for the Xbox 360s that were suffering from the Red Ring of Death, and it was, again, another refinement on the Xbox 360 motherboard to help avoid the Red Ring of Death happening again. This one, though, actually has another key difference, which is that they changed the power plug. See, because the Xenon motherboard, the ELPIS motherboard, and one other motherboard we'll talk about here in a bit used this 203 watt power supply, which for the time was a pretty beefy power supply. But with the Opus motherboard, this was the first time that Microsoft changed the actual power supply and the power plug for the Xbox 360 to a 175 watt power supply. So a little more power efficiency for anybody who actually cared. But if you're rocking one of these, you know that you have one of the early versions of the Xenon or the ELPIS motherboard. Regardless, when it comes to my recommendations, I cannot recommend this non-AV version of the Xbox 360 in any version. Unless you're a collector and it's not really going to get used like this one, where the only reason I got it was for this video and because it had its original box. This is not going to be playing games, because with no service date and an original Xenon motherboard, and from everything I can tell without opening it, the original tiny GPU heatsink, there is no way on earth that I am trusting this thing to survive. So this one is not going to get a recommendation from me. Avoid the Opus, the ELPIS, and the Xenon motherboards with every possible opportunity. Just don't do it. Just don't. Please, for the love of God, don't do it. These are a cool piece of history that deserve to be sat on a shelf if you have one that is a survivor like this one. It is going back in its box. It is going to stay on the shelf when I get a new house, and that is it. If you don't have an HDMI port on the back of one of these, run away. And so now that I have that glowing not recommendation out of the way, let's move on to the next revision of the Xbox 360, which is referred to as the Zephyr motherboard. And the Xbox I'm going to use for this demonstration warrants a bit of an explanation. So this actually started life as a 2007 Xbox 360 Elite. And the Zephyr motherboard was launched with the Xbox 360 Elite. In fact, it was the first Xbox 360 with an HDMI port in 2007. I always wanted an Xbox 360 with HDMI, and I bought the first one that they made. And you can even tell because it has the black top and bottom grills. But I still love the aesthetic of the white Xbox 360 with the chrome disc tray. And at the time, I was actually repairing Xbox 360s that were having motherboard issues. And so at a certain point, somebody came in with an Xbox 360 Premium a couple months after the Elite had come out, which had the HDMI revision, also a Zephyr motherboard. And I figured, hey, while I'm here fixing your Xbox 360, hopefully, which I did fix it, but I said, while I'm in here fixing it, would you like to change the shell out for a black Elite one? Because I have always wanted a white one with HDMI, and I wasn't patient enough to wait for the premium version to come out. And they said, sure, so I got a white Xbox 360 with the black grills and a spot for HDMI while still keeping the Zephyr motherboard. So let's talk about the Zephyr motherboard. The Zephyr motherboard for the Xbox 360 was first announced in May of 2007 for the Elite model of the Xbox. It was the first to feature HDMI, which was a big deal for me and for a lot of people, and it came in an all-black chassis because that was just how they decided to design the Elite. It also had a 120 gig hard drive, but I haven't really been talking about storage because if you buy any of these new Xbox 360s, like put 10 bucks aside to throw a 60 or a 120 gig hard drive on this thing. It's really not that hard. Microsoft did also improve the heatsink for the Zephyr motherboard, though if you're not taking one of these apart, you're never going to see it. But basically, they added a heat pipe to the tiny little heatsink of the Xenon motherboard and ran a couple more heat sinks out in front of the GPU cooler, so you just had more air going to the GPU, which was the core problem to begin with. And so because the GPU is still the main issue and the cooling really didn't do a whole lot to help these things, they still suffer from the same GPU-related red rings of death as the Xenon motherboards, though some people say that the ones produced after Q2 of 2008 are a little bit better, but regardless, spoilers, these still don't get a recommendation from me, even though this is the one that somehow survived me taking it, you know, all over the country and covering it in stickers like the Achievement Hunter one, rest in peace. But let me just show you how you can tell if this is a Zephyr motherboard. So again, it all starts by turning the console around, and of course the first thing you'll see is the HDMI port underneath of the AV port. Now that's a really good first sign because, well, obviously the HDMI port means that you have something that isn't Xeon, Opus, or Elpis, but you still have to keep an eye out for the manufacturing date. Like I mentioned before, the sticker here will tell you when it was made. Same rules as the Xenon board still apply. If it's a manufacturing date, I would be kind of worried. Again, unless it's around that Q2 that I mentioned of 2008, but again, I can't really guarantee that. So manufacturing date, kind of a no-go. And if it's a service date, it might be okay. If you're willing to take the gamble, it might be all right. But again, can't really recommend that because from everything I could tell, these Xenon motherboards were basically just getting replaced with more Xenon motherboards until later, in which case they started putting Falcon motherboards in, which we'll talk about those here in a minute. But again, the last way you can tell is by the power socket. It's the same power supply as what I mentioned on the Xenon motherboard, where you're working with the 6-prong, the weird centering plug, and the line at the top. You're working with a 203 watt power supply. Now, there were some later revisions of these that were using what was called the Falcon motherboard, and let me break down what the Falcon motherboard was. The Falcon motherboard saw an improvement of the CPU, reducing it from a 90 or an 85 nanometer chipset to a 65 nanometer chipset, so the CPU was drawing generally a bit less power, which means that it also got the upgraded power supply, or the lower power draw power supply, the 75 watt version that the Opus motherboard got. So less power draw, more efficient CPU. You did get the improved heatsink on the inside, but again, you're not going to see that. And then later they actually improved the heatsink of the CPU to a fully aluminum block instead of this weird heat pipe thing. But again, if you're looking at one of these from the outside, you're not really going to be able to tell unless you look at the power socket, the HDMI and AV connectors, and the power supply itself. Speaking of the power supply, a lot of times when you're looking at one of these in a store, they're going to be facing you, and if they're in a case or in a shelf, you can't really look at the back ports, so just at the front, you're not going to tell if it's a Xenon, a Zephyr, or whatever, but there is one way to tell, or at least get you in the ballpark of which revision you have, and that is by looking at the power supply if it's sitting somewhere nearby with it. Because if we look at something like the 203 watt power supply, and we compare it to a later one that we're going to talk about, the 150 watt power supply, there's a pretty considerable difference. So if you're not sure which one you're looking at, and you have a chance to look at the power supply before you look at the back of one of these, definitely take that opportunity because it could save you a lot of hassle. Regardless, what I said before still stands. I don't really recommend the Zephyr motherboard, nor do I recommend the Falcon motherboard, which was the later revision of this, just because, yeah, there were some improvements made later that people claim made it a bit more reliable, but until they started to really get the GPU's heat problem under control with more than just more heat sinks, you're just not getting a recommendation from me. And again, this thing sits on a shelf now. It was my daily driver Xbox, and it's kind of an anomaly to me. It's been apart more times than my car. It's still functional, at least the last time I checked, and yet it's the one I don't often recommend. So, I mean, if that somehow convinces you to buy one of these or that these are okay, then by all means. But for me, that just tells me that the failure rate of these is inconsistent. So regardless, if you have an Xbox 360 with a Zephyr motherboard and it still works, good on you. If you're looking to buy one and you are not sure if you should get the Zephyr or the one we're about to talk about, get the one we're about to talk about. But that wraps up what I'll call the HDMI V1 version. So let's move on to the final form of the Xbox 360 Phat Edition. Obviously, Microsoft's a smart company and they're not going to sit still when there's a console that has some heating problems, so they're going to iterate one last time before changing the entire console design to the slim model we know today. And this is the one that everybody in the comments section was creaming their jeans over. This is the Jasper version of the Xbox 360 Phat version. What the hell is a Jasper version? Well, again, for the sake of accuracy, there are two versions of the Jasper motherboard. One is just Jasper, and one is Jasper V2, Jasper Chronos, or some other weird name. Tonasket? Okay, whatever. Point is, this is the Xbox 360 that everybody got mad at me about for still saying that I don't recommend the Phat ones because they're not reliable. Because yes, this is the most reliable of the entire Phat era of the Xbox 360s. It is, it really is. They refined the GPU, they refined the CPU, the power draw is now down to a 150 watt power supply instead of 175 or 203, and everything about it is just the final form of the Phat Xbox 360s. Nobody can take that away from this console, but it still has the red ring of death. In fact, this one still gets the red ring of death. I saved it the same way I saved my slim Xbox 360, which is by taking the motherboard out and putting it in the oven at 450 for 10 minutes. I am not joking. But my personal experiences aside, the Jasper motherboard version of the Xbox 360 is still the most reliable of the Phat Xbox 360s. So if you have the opportunity to get one of these, I would absolutely recommend it. And the version I'm using here also requires a bit of an explainer. The Jasper motherboards started making their way out into the market around late 2008, and this Xbox 360 actually started its life as an arcade Xbox 360 in around November when I bought it. And that means that the Chrome disc tray is not actually what it came with. I put that on myself. And this top shell is not accurate with the manufacturing date that says 11/11 of 2007, which rhymes. No, what had happened was for this particular model, I had stuff sitting on top of this because it lived on my desk when I was running a YouTube channel called Not So Awesome Gaming with some friends, and whatever was sitting on top of it stained it, and I didn't think to sand it away because, well, I'm not GameStop and I'm not gonna rub everything down with a magic eraser, so I just had a bunch of Xbox 360 parts from my days of repairing them, and I just grabbed one that looked good enough and slapped it on. So to this day, I only have one Xbox 360 with the correct shell on it. Oh well. But ignoring all that, let's take a look at how you can tell that this is a Jasper motherboard. First and foremost, of course, is the HDMI and AV ports, which it has. So it's not a Xenon or a Elpis or Opus. On the manufacturing sticker back here, you should have a date somewhere towards the latter portion of 2008, and basically anything getting into 2009, whether it be manufacturing or service, you're golden. You've got yourself a Jasper motherboard. So again, anything in the latter portion of 2008, getting into 2009, you're golden. Jasper motherboard it is. And just like all the online guides show you, if you look at the power supply plug, you'll see that this is the third and final revision of this type of power supply plug. Just like on the Falcon and Opus motherboards, there is no center alignment piece like there was on the first power supply plug, and they also took the little bar that runs across the top of all the prongs and now made it into two pieces instead of one. I'm assuming they did that just to make sure that people didn't use the wrong power supply with this generation of the Xbox 360, but it's just kind of a weird modification to make. But like aside from those key three things, the HDMI port, the manufacturing date sticker, and the power connector, there's really no external way of telling whether or not you have a Zephyr motherboard or a Jasper motherboard without knowing those things. So once you get into the realm of HDMI Xbox 360s, you're going to want to make sure you pay attention to that. So now that we've talked about every single difference between the Xbox 360 Phat motherboards and what to look out for if you're looking to buy one, which Xbox 360 would I use if I wanted to go back and relive the nostalgia of the Xbox 360 console? For me personally, I would buy the Xbox 360e. It's kind of a spoiler for my other video, which if you want to see the comparison between those, you can check it out over there after this video. But seriously, I would buy the Xbox 360e because it was the last revision of any of the Xbox 360s, and it's the least likely to get the red ring. But if I absolutely had to pick a Phat model Xbox 360, just like all the comments said, I would absolutely pick a Jasper motherboard. Between the fact that it's the final form of the Phat Xbox 360, which in my opinion is the best looking of the Xbox 360s, period, and the fact that they actually improved on the reliability, it draws less power, it creates less heat. Yes, you will still need to maintain them, and if you're going to be playing it pretty aggressively like it's a new console, you're definitely going to want to make sure that thermal paste is fresh. But if you can spot one using the ways that I showed you, the Jasper motherboard version of the Xbox 360 is absolutely the way to go. And if you can find yourself an actually half-decent little hard drive, or swap this out for an SSD if you are feeling adventurous, these are definitely a fantastic way of getting into some, kills me to say this, retro gaming. Also, something worth noting as well, this is the last generation of consoles, along with the PS3, where you can actually play the games off the disc. Everything else is going to require you to put a disc in and then install the disc and most likely run an update or download the remainder of the game. Every single game that you buy for an Xbox 360, and this was a requirement from Microsoft, had to be able to be played on the disc. Yeah, you might have to install some of the disc from disc A or disc B like you did with, what was it, Assassin's Creed and GTA 5, but you could still just play this with the disc and you didn't need an internet connection. I mean, Don Matrick said it himself.
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
But yeah, either way, you can find reliable versions of the Phat Xbox 360 in the same way that you can find the skinniest person at Phat Camp. But yes, if you find yourself a Jasper console, these can be the most reliable versions of the Xbox 360 in the Phat chassis. So if you use what I taught you, you can go and find one of these and have a nostalgic and ideally reliable experience. Just keep in mind, these are older consoles and they may still need maintenance because thermal paste dries up, and that is going to be one of the biggest killers of these things because the biggest issue they have always faced is heat. So be prepared for that, but if you can find one that's already been refurbished or you're willing to do it yourself, you can get yourself a reasonably reliable Phat Xbox 360 experience. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, go ahead and leave a like, maybe subscribe so you don't miss content like this in the future. I do have some other stuff planned for these consoles, but not at the moment. Regardless, I appreciate you all watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.